The crack of a whip sliced through the dusty afternoon air of Willow Creek, Wyoming, in the summer of 1876, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot, including Thomas Vallance, who had just ridden into town after 3 long months on the cattle drive from Texas. The sound was unmistakable and jarring, followed by a woman's muffled cry that set his blood to boiling before he even saw the source. Hannah Foster fought to keep her footing as she stumbled backward, her cheek stinging from the first lash. Dust clung to her simple blue cotton dress, now torn at the shoulder from where she'd been dragged behind the mercantile by Edwin Blackburn, the store owner who employed her and who now towered over her with rage twisting his features. "I told you what would happen if the accounts didn't balance," Blackburn snarled, his broad shoulders blocking the fading sunlight. His face had turned a dangerous shade of crimson beneath his neatly trimmed beard. $20 missing, and you expect me to believe it was just a mistake. "Please, Mr. Blackburn," Hannah pleaded, one hand raised defensively while the other pressed against the wooden wall of the building for support. "I'll work extra hours to make it up, but I swear I didn't take anything. The Miller family bought supplies on credit yesterday. Perhaps I forgot to. Enough lies." Blackburn raised the whip again, its shadow falling across Hannah's face as she flinched away. The blow never landed. Thomas Vallance's hand shot out, catching the whip mid-air with a grip hardened by years of ranch work. The leather cord wrapped tightly around his palm and wrist, drawing a thin line of blood where it bit into his skin, but his expression revealed no pain, only cold fury. "That's no way to treat a lady," Thomas said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the sudden silence of the alleyway. With a sharp twist of his wrist, he yanked the whip from Blackburn's grasp and snapped it in half with his other hand, tossing the broken pieces at the merchant's feet. Blackburn sputtered, his face reddening further. "This is none of your business, Cowboy. This woman is a thief, and I'm within my rights. No man has the right to lay a hand or a whip on a woman," Thomas interrupted, stepping between Hannah and her enraged employer. At 6'2", he stood several inches taller than Blackburn, his broad shoulders and lean, muscular frame shaped by years of hard labor. "Now back away before I forget my manners entirely." Hannah stared up at her unexpected defender, taking in his sun-bronzed face, the dust-covered denim pants, and the worn leather vest over a once white shirt. His dark brown hat, pushed back slightly, revealed eyes the color of a summer storm gray with hints of blue that seemed to flash with the intensity of his anger. A thin line of blood trickled from where the whip had cut into his hand, but he appeared not to notice. Blackburn looked from the cowboy to the small crowd gathering at the mouth of the alley. Humiliation replaced some of his anger as he realized how this must look to the townspeople. "She still owes me for what she stole," he insisted, but the bluster had left his voice. "I didn't steal anything," Hannah said, finding her courage now that she wasn't alone. She straightened her dress with trembling hands, wincing as her fingers brushed against her injured cheek. $20, you say?" Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. He counted out the sum and held it toward Blackburn. "Here, now consider her debt paid." Blackburn hesitated before snatching the money. "Fine, but she's finished at my store. I want her belongings cleared out of the room upstairs by morning." After Blackburn stormed away, Thomas turned to the young woman. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, his voice softening considerably. "Yes, thank you." Hannah looked up at him, finally able to take a proper breath. "But you shouldn't have paid him. I didn't take that money." "I believe you." Thomas gestured to her cheek. "That needs tending." "I'll manage." Hannah straightened her shoulders, pride evident despite her situation. "But I don't know how I can repay you for your help, Mr. Vallance, Thomas Vallance." He removed his hat and offered a small bow. "And there's no debt between us, miss. Foster, Hannah Foster." She extended her hand, which he took gently. "But I insist on repaying you, Mr. Vallance. $20 is no small sum." Thomas replaced his hat and shook his head. "Let's get that cheek looked at first." "Is there a doctor in town?" Dr. Pearson, but his office is clear on the other side of town, and she glanced back at the mercantile, anxiety creasing her brow. I need to gather my things. Mr. Blackburn wasn't bluffing about throwing me out. Thomas frowned. You lived above the store. It was part of my arrangement, room and board in exchange for reduced wages. Hannah brushed dust from her skirt. I'll need to find somewhere else now and another position. A moment of quiet calculation passed before Thomas spoke again. I'm staying at the boarding house down the street. Mrs. Williams might have a room for you, at least temporarily. I couldn't impose, you wouldn't be imposing. She runs a business, after all. His smile was gentle. And as for your belongings, I'd be happy to help you collect them while Blackburn is occupied elsewhere. Hannah studied him carefully, weighing her limited options against trusting this stranger who had already shown her more kindness than most. Finally, she nodded. I would appreciate that, Mr. Vallance. Thomas, he corrected. If we're to be hauling your possessions across town together, I think we can dispense with formalities. For the first time since he'd encountered her, Hannah smiled, though it clearly pained her injured cheek. Thomas, then. Within an hour, they had removed Hannah's modest belongings from the small room above the mercantile, 2 dresses, some undergarments quickly bundled into a pillowcase, a worn Bible, a hairbrush, and a small wooden box containing a locket and a few letters. Thomas carried everything except the box, which Hannah clutched close to her chest as they walked to the boarding house. Mrs. Williams, a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, took one look at Hannah's face and ushered them inside, clucking her tongue in disapproval. That Edwin Blackburn should be ashamed, she declared as she led Hannah to a chair in the kitchen and began preparing a cold compress. Not the first time he's raised a hand to someone who couldn't fight back, though usually it's the stock boys. You know Mr. Blackburn? Hannah asked, wincing as Mrs. Williams gently pressed the compress to her cheek. Lived in Willow Creek all my life, dear. I know everyone. She gave Thomas an appraising look. Including drifters who pass through. You're new, though. Just arrived today, Thomas confirmed. Thomas Vallance. I've been on the trail with a cattle drive from Texas, planning to stay a while before deciding where to head next. Mrs. Williams nodded. Well, you've done a good deed already. Hannah here is one of the hardest working girls in town, never believed she'd steal so much as a penny. She patted Hannah's shoulder. I've got a room at the back of the house. It's small, but it's yours for as long as you need it. I can't pay much, Hannah admitted, at least not until I find new work. You can help with the cooking and cleaning to make up the difference, Mrs. Williams decided. I'm not as spry as I used to be, and this place keeps me busy enough. Relief washed over Hannah's face. Thank you, Mrs. Williams. I won't let you down. I know you won't. The older woman looked between them. Now, Mr. Vallance, I assume you'll be wanting a room as well. If you have one available, Thomas confirmed. Second floor, first door on the right, $1 a night, meals included. She eyed his trail-worn clothes. And there's a bathhouse out back if you're interested. Thomas chuckled. That obvious, is it? 3 months on the trail tends to leave its mark, Mrs. Williams said diplomatically. Dinner's at 6, don't be late. After she bustled away, Thomas turned to Hannah. Seems you've landed on your feet. Thanks to you. Hannah lowered the compress, revealing the angry red mark on her cheek. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along when you did. I'm just glad I was there. Thomas hesitated, then reached for his hat. I should get cleaned up before dinner, Hannah nodded. Of course, and Thomas, she caught his gaze, thank you. Not just for stopping him, but for believing me about the money. Some things you can just tell about a person, he replied with a small smile before heading upstairs. Hannah watched him go, wondering what twist of fate had brought this quiet, steadfast cowboy to Willow Creek precisely when she needed him most. By the time dinner was served, Thomas had bathed, shaved, and changed into cleaner clothes. His dark hair, still damp, curled slightly at his collar and without the layer of trail dust. His features were more refined than Hannah had initially noticed: strong jawline, straight nose, and those remarkable gray-blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with calm assessment. The boarding house dining room held 3 other guests besides Thomas. An elderly man who introduced himself as Judge Harmon, retired and traveling to visit his daughter in Montana. A cattle buyer named Peterson who was in town on business, and a young woman called Sarah Miller who worked as a schoolteacher. Mrs. Williams presided over the table, keeping conversation flowing and plates filled. Hannah helped serve the meal, a hearty stew with fresh bread, before taking her own seat beside Thomas. Her cheek had developed an impressive bruise, but she held her head high despite the curious glances from the other diners. "Miss Foster, what happened to your face?" Sarah finally asked, her concern evident. Before Hannah could respond, Mrs. Williams answered smoothly, "An unfortunate misunderstanding with Edwin Blackburn that's been resolved, thanks to Mr. Vallance here." Judge Harmon harumphed. "Blackburn's always been too quick with his temper. Saw him drag a boy behind the store once for supposedly short-changing him. Boy swore up and down he'd given the right change, but Blackburn wouldn't hear it." "Did he hit the boy?" Thomas asked quietly. "Would have if Sheriff Taylor hadn't happened by." The judge shook his head. "Unfortunately, being unpleasant isn't against the law, or Blackburn would have been locked up years ago." Peterson, the cattle buyer, snorted. "Man's a menace to commerce too, charges twice what goods are worth, then acts like he's doing you a favor." "Yet the mercantile thrives," Mrs. Williams observed, "because he's the only store for 20 miles in any direction." Hannah remained silent throughout this exchange, her eyes fixed on her plate. Thomas noticed her discomfort and deftly changed the subject, asking Peterson about cattle prices and the market in Wyoming Territory, drawing attention away from her. After dinner, while the others retired to the parlor for coffee, Hannah slipped outside to the small porch that wrapped around the boarding house. The evening air had cooled considerably, and she hugged her arms against the chill, watching as the last streaks of purple and orange faded from the western sky. "You'll catch cold out here." Thomas's voice came from behind her as he draped a shawl over her shoulders, one of Mrs. Williams, she presumed. "Thank you." Hannah pulled it tighter around herself. "I just needed some air, it's been quite a day." Thomas leaned against the porch railing beside her. "That's putting it mildly." "I keep thinking about what Judge Harmon said about the boy Blackburn accused of short-changing him." Hannah turned to face Thomas. "It's a pattern with him, isn't it? Accusing people of stealing when things don't add up the way he thinks they should." "Seems that way," Thomas agreed. "Makes me wonder if there was any money missing at all, or if he just wanted an excuse." "An excuse to fire me, you mean?" Hannah frowned. "But why? I've worked there for nearly a year without incident." Thomas shrugged. "Some men don't need much reason to be cruel. Sometimes it's just in their nature." They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Hannah spoke again. "What brings you to Willow Creek? You said you were with a cattle drive." "Yes, from the Rockingham Ranch outside of San Antonio. We delivered 3,000 head to the railroad in Cheyenne, and the boys headed back south while I decided to try my luck up here." Thomas gazed out at the darkening town. "I've been working cattle since I was 15, but I'm thinking it might be time for something different." "Like what?" "Not sure yet," he smiled faintly. "Maybe a place of my own someday, a small spread, nothing fancy, just enough to build something that lasts." Hannah studied his profile in the fading light. "That sounds nice, having something that's truly yours." "What about you?" Thomas turned to face her. "Have you always lived in Willow Creek?" "No, I came here from Denver about a year ago. My parents died of influenza when I was 16, and I lived with my aunt for a while, but she remarried and her new husband." Hannah trailed off. "Well, let's just say it was better for everyone if I made my own way." Thomas's expression darkened with understanding. "So you came here." "Willow Creek was as far as my money would take me," she admitted. "The position at Blackburn's wasn't ideal, but it was honest work, or so I thought." "What will you do now?" Hannah sighed. "Find another position, I suppose. Mrs. Williams said she could use help around here, but I don't think it would be enough to support myself entirely." "The town's growing," Thomas observed. "Bound to be opportunities." "Perhaps." Hannah turned back to the view of the small town, its windows now glowing with lamplight against the gathering darkness. "At least I have a roof over my head tonight, thanks to you." "You'd have managed," Thomas said with quiet confidence. "You strike me as a woman who finds a way no matter what." Hannah gave him a surprised look, touched by his assessment. "That's kind of you to say, not kindness, just observation." He straightened from the railing. It's getting cold, we should head inside. As they turned to go, Hannah paused with her hand on the door. Will you be staying in Willow Creek long? Thomas met her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Longer than I'd planned, I think. The next morning, Hannah woke early, her face tender but less swollen than she'd feared. She dressed quickly in her best remaining dress, a simple brown cotton with slightly faded trim, and made her way downstairs to help Mrs. Williams with breakfast. The older woman was already at work in the kitchen, kneading dough for biscuits. Ah, there you are, dear. Sleep well. Well enough, thank you. Hannah reached for an apron. What can I help with? You can slice that ham and start the eggs. The men will be down soon, and they eat like they've been starved for a month. Mrs. Williams eyed Hannah's bruised cheek. That looks painful. It's better today, Hannah assured her, setting to work with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to kitchen duties. They worked together seamlessly, and by the time the boarders began filtering into the dining room, a substantial breakfast was ready. Thomas was the last to arrive, freshly shaven and dressed in clean clothes, though still unmistakably a working cowboy in his denim pants, cotton shirt, and worn boots. Morning, he greeted, his eyes lingering briefly on Hannah's bruise before he took his seat. Breakfast conversation revolved around local news and the judge's imminent departure for Montana. As Hannah cleared the dishes afterward, she overheard Peterson, the cattle buyer, speaking with Thomas. If you're looking for work, Vallance, the Double Bar Ranch, is hiring. Old man Jenkins lost 2 hands to gold fever last month when rumors of a strike up near the Tetons started circulating. He's short-staffed and offering good wages. I appreciate the tip, Thomas replied, though I was thinking of something in town for a while. My last horse came up lame just outside of Cheyenne, and I sold her to a farmer rather than push her further. I'll need to save up for a new mount before taking on ranch work again. Town, eh? Peterson scratched his chin thoughtfully. Well, the livery might need help. Or you could try the saloon. They're always looking for men who can handle trouble without causing more of it, if you catch my meaning. Thomas nodded. I'll look into it, thanks. As the men dispersed, Hannah approached Thomas with the coffee pot. More coffee, please. He held out his cup. I heard you're going job hunting today. Yes, Mrs. Williams suggested I try the hotel first. They often need help with laundry and cleaning. Thomas grimaced slightly. Hard work for little pay. Beggars can't be choosers, Hannah replied pragmatically. What about you? Will you try the livery? Among other places, he sipped his coffee. Would you mind if I walked with you? I thought I'd get the lay of the town and it might be safer if you had company your first day back out after yesterday's incident. Hannah felt a flush of warmth at his consideration. I'd welcome the company, thank you. An hour later, they set out together into the bustling morning activity of Willow Creek. Though small compared to Denver or Cheyenne, the town had grown considerably in recent years. A single main street was lined with businesses: the mercantile, a bank, the hotel, 2 saloons, a barber shop, and various other establishments catering to both locals and travelers passing through on their way further west. Their first stop was the Grand Western Hotel, a somewhat grandiose name for the 2-story wooden structure that nonetheless served as the finest accommodation in town. The manager, a harried man named Simmons, barely looked at Hannah's face as she inquired about positions. We need someone for laundry and to help the maids with turn-down service, he confirmed. 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset, $2 a week plus 1 meal a day. Can you start tomorrow? Hannah hesitated, taken aback by the low wage even Blackburn had paid her $3 weekly. I was hoping for something that might pay a bit more, Mr. Simmons. I have experience with bookkeeping and laundry and cleaning is what I need, Simmons cut her off. Take it or leave it. Hannah felt Thomas stiffen beside her but kept her composure. I'll think on it and let you know by this afternoon if that's acceptable, Simmons shrugged. Suit yourself, but I've got 3 other girls asking after the position. Outside, Thomas frowned. $2 a week is robbery. It is, Hannah agreed, but it might be all I can get, especially with... She gestured vaguely toward her bruised face. Word spreads quickly in small towns and Blackburn has friends. Thomas's jaw tightened. We'll find something better. Their next stops the dressmaker's shop, the bakery, and even the small newspaper office yielded nothing. By midday, Hannah's spirits were flagging, though she maintained a brave face. Maybe I should go back to the hotel, she said as they paused outside the barber shop. At least until something better comes along. Before Thomas could respond, the barbershop door opened, and a well-dressed man in his 60s emerged, nearly colliding with them. "Pardon me," he said, stepping back. His eyes widened slightly at Hannah's bruised face, but he recovered quickly. "Are you all right, miss?" "Yes, thank you," Hannah replied, embarrassed at the attention. The man studied her for a moment, then extended his hand. "Samuel Richardson, I own the bank down the street." "Hannah Foster," she replied, shaking his hand, "and this is Thomas Vallance." Richardson nodded to Thomas before returning his attention to Hannah. "Miss Foster, forgive my directness, but are you by any chance looking for employment?" Hannah blinked in surprise. "I am, actually. How did you know?" Richardson smiled. "Mrs. Williams mentioned this morning that you were seeking a position after some trouble with Edwin Blackburn. She speaks very highly of you." "That's kind of her," Hannah said, hope stirring within her. "Do you have an opening at the bank?" "As a matter of fact, I do. My assistant left last month to get married, and I've been struggling to manage the books myself." "Mrs. Williams mentioned you have experience with figures." "Yes, sir. I handled all the accounts at the mercantile, as well as inventory and ordering." Richardson nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Would you be willing to come by the bank tomorrow morning? We can discuss the particulars then." "I would be delighted," Hannah replied, barely containing her excitement. After Richardson departed, Hannah turned to Thomas with shining eyes. "Can you believe it, the bank? That would be a proper position with decent wages." Thomas smiled, genuinely pleased for her. "You deserve it, and the timing couldn't be better." "What about you?" Hannah asked as they continued down the street. "Any luck with your search?" "Not yet, but the day's still young." Thomas gestured toward the livery stable at the end of the street. "That's my next stop." The livery owner, a grizzled old-timer named Hank Sullivan, was sweeping the yard when they arrived. He eyed Thomas with the assessing gaze of a man who had seen his share of drifters. "Help you?" he asked, leaning on his broom. "Looking for work," Thomas replied straightforwardly. "I heard you might need an extra hand." Sullivan scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Might do. You know horses? Worked with them all my life. Can shoe them, doctor minor ailments, break them if needed." "Breaking's not much called for here," Sullivan admitted. "Mostly it's caring for travelers' mounts, keeping the stalls clean, and making deliveries with the wagon around town." "I can handle that." Sullivan looked him up and down once more. $4 a week, room in the loft if you want it. Trial period of 2 weeks, then we'll talk about making it permanent if we suit each other." Thomas nodded. "Fair enough. When do you want me to start?" "Now's good as any time," Sullivan replied. "Got a wagon of feed that needs unloading." Thomas glanced at Hannah, who smiled encouragingly. "Go ahead. I should get back to Mrs. Williams anyway. I promised to help with lunch." "I'll see you at dinner then." "I'll be there," she promised. As Thomas followed Sullivan into the stable, Hannah made her way back to the boarding house, her steps lighter than they had been in months. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, she felt a glimmer of real hope for her future and an unexpected warmth whenever she thought of the quiet cowboy who had changed her fortunes with one brave act. Over the next 2 weeks, a rhythm developed. Hannah began work at the bank, where Mr. Richardson proved to be a fair and considerate employer. The position paid $5 weekly more than she'd ever earned, and the hours were reasonable, allowing her to continue helping Mrs. Williams in exchange for reduced rent. Thomas quickly proved his worth at the livery, impressing Sullivan with his knowledge of horses and tireless work ethic. Though he slept in the loft above the stable, he took his meals at the boarding house, where dinner conversations with Hannah became the highlight of both their days. They learned about each other in these quiet moments, Thomas's childhood on a small farm in Missouri, before his family lost everything in a drought, prompting his move to Texas to find work. Hannah's dreams of someday opening a small shop of her own, their shared love of reading despite limited opportunities for education. On Sundays, when both had the day free, They began taking walks together through town or along the creek that gave Willow Creek its name. It was during one such walk, 2 weeks after their first meeting, that Hannah finally broached the subject of Blackburn again. "I saw him yesterday," she said as they sat on the bank of the creek, watching the water ripple over stones. "He came into the bank to make a deposit and acted as though nothing had ever happened between us." Thomas frowned. "Did he say anything to you?" "Not directly. He spoke only to Mr. Richardson, though he kept looking at me when he thought I wouldn't notice." Hannah plucked a blade of grass, twisting it between her fingers. "The strange thing is, his deposit included exactly $20 in coins, the same amount he accused me of stealing." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That seems significant, doesn't it? And Mr. Richardson mentioned afterward that Blackburn's books have been inconsistent lately. He's been making unusual withdrawals and deposits that don't align with the store's regular business patterns." "You think he's hiding something?" Hannah shrugged. "I don't know, but I'm beginning to wonder if the missing money was just a convenient excuse to get rid of me because I was getting too close to figuring something out." Thomas was silent for a moment, considering. "Have you mentioned this to Richardson?" "Not in so many words. It feels petty, as if I'm trying to get back at Blackburn for firing me." Hannah sighed. "Besides, I have no proof of anything. Still, if the man is involved in something dishonest, Richardson should know. He's a banker, after all. Financial improprieties would concern him." Hannah nodded slowly. "You're right. I'll speak with him privately on Monday." They sat in companionable silence for a while until Thomas cleared his throat. "Sullivan offered to make my position permanent yesterday, with a raise to $5 weekly." Hannah turned to him with a bright smile. "Thomas, that's wonderful. So you'll be staying in Willow Creek, it seems so." He met her gaze, something warm and unspoken passing between them. "I've grown rather fond of the place." The flush that spread across Hannah's cheeks had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "I'm glad. I've grown fond of the place as well." That evening, as they walked back to town side by side, Thomas's hand brushed against Hannah's, and after a moment's hesitation, their fingers intertwined. Neither commented on this development, but both wore small, private smiles all the way back to the boarding house. Monday morning brought an unexpected development. Hannah arrived at the bank to find Mr. Richardson in an agitated state, pacing behind the counter with a letter clutched in his hand. "Miss Foster, good morning," he greeted her distractedly. "I've just received troubling news. The bank examiner will be arriving from Cheyenne tomorrow, 3 weeks ahead of schedule." "Is that a problem, sir?" Hannah asked, hanging her shawl on the hook by the door. Richardson sighed heavily. "It wouldn't be, except for these discrepancies I've been finding in some of our accounts. Nothing substantial, but enough that I'd hope to have time to sort them out before the examination." Hannah felt a chill of apprehension. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Small amounts missing here and there, mostly from the accounts of ranchers who don't come to town often. I noticed it last month but assumed it was a bookkeeping error." He gave her an apologetic look. "That's why I was so eager to hire someone with your skills. I've never been particularly adept with figures myself." Hannah moved to her desk, her mind racing. "May I see the ledgers in question?" "Perhaps I can help identify the pattern." Richardson handed over several heavy leather-bound books. "I'd be most grateful for any assistance, Miss Foster. My reputation and the bank's depends on these records being accurate." For the next several hours, Hannah pored over the accounts, meticulously comparing entries, dates, and amounts. By mid-afternoon, a clear pattern had emerged, and with it, a sinking feeling in her stomach. "Mr. Richardson," she called softly, "I believe I've found something." The banker hurried over, peering at the ledgers she had arranged side by side. "These withdrawals," Hannah explained, pointing to several entries, "all occurred on days when you were out of town on business. According to these notes, they were authorized by a secondary signature, which appears to be—" She hesitated. "Edwin Blackburn," Richardson finished grimly, examining the signature. "He's on the bank's board of directors and has authorization to approve transactions in my absence, though he rarely exercises it. And each withdrawal," Hannah continued, Comes from an account belonging to a rancher or businessman who visits town infrequently. Small amounts, $10 here, 15 there, nothing that would immediately raise alarm if noticed at all. Richardson's face had grown pale. How much in total? Nearly $500 over the past 6 months. Good Lord. The banker sank into a nearby chair. And I've been oblivious all this time. Hannah hesitated before adding, "There's more, sir. Each withdrawal is followed within a day or two by a deposit of the same amount into Mr. Blackburn's personal account, but never the full amount at once. It's broken into smaller deposits as though to avoid attention." Richardson's expression hardened. "That explains his recent profitable ventures. I should have been more suspicious when he suddenly had money to invest after complaining about poor business for months. What will you do, sir?" "Confront him, of course, with evidence this clear." Richardson broke off as the bank's door opened, and Edwin Blackburn himself entered, nodding cordially to them both as if nothing were amiss. "Afternoon, Richardson, Miss Foster." His eyes narrowed slightly at Hannah, but his smile remained fixed. "I've come to make another deposit, if you please." Richardson rose slowly, his usual genial manner replaced by cold formality. "Of course, Mr. Blackburn, I was actually hoping to speak with you about some irregularities I've discovered in our accounts." Something flickered in Blackburn's eyes, alarm, quickly masked by confusion. "Irregularities? What sort? Perhaps we should discuss this in my office." Richardson gestured toward the small room at the back of the bank. As Blackburn hesitated, the banker added firmly, "Now, if you please." After they disappeared into the office, Hannah remained at her desk, straining to hear the conversation but catching only the rise and fall of voices, occasionally sharp with tension. 10 minutes later, the office door flew open and Blackburn stormed out, his face mottled with rage. "This is preposterous," he shouted over his shoulder at Richardson. "You'll regret making these accusations." As he passed Hannah's desk, Blackburn paused, leaning down to hiss, "You did this. I knew you were trouble the moment you started questioning my bookkeeping. This isn't over." Before Hannah could respond, he stormed out of the bank, the door slamming behind him. She turned to Richardson, who looked both shaken and resolute. "He denied everything, of course," the banker said, straightening his vest. "But the evidence is irrefutable. I've given him until tomorrow to return the money, or I'll be forced to involve Sheriff Taylor." "Do you think he will? Return the money, I mean." Richardson shook his head wearily. "I doubt it. Blackburn has always been too proud to admit wrongdoing, but I had to offer him the chance to make this right before taking more drastic measures." Hannah nodded, then bit her lip. "Mr. Richardson, given what just happened, would you mind if I left a bit early today?" "I'm concerned that Mr. Blackburn might." "Say no more," Richardson interrupted. "Of course you may go, and Miss Foster." He placed a fatherly hand on her shoulder. "Thank you for your diligence in uncovering this. You've proven your worth to this bank many times over." Hannah gathered her things quickly, her heart pounding as she stepped onto the street. The confrontation with Blackburn had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She hurried toward the livery, hoping to find Thomas before heading back to the boarding house. She was halfway there when a rough hand grabbed her arm, yanking her into the narrow alley between the barber shop and the hardware store. Blackburn's face loomed before her, contorted with fury. "You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" He snarled, his fingers digging painfully into her arm. "Had to play the righteous little bookkeeper digging through accounts that were none of your business." "Mr. Blackburn, please," Hannah gasped, trying to pull away. "You're hurting me." "Hurting you?" He gave a harsh laugh. "I'm just getting started. You've ruined me in this town. My reputation, my position on the bank board, all destroyed because you couldn't mind your own affairs." His free hand shot out, striking her across the face in the same spot he'd hit before. Pain exploded through Hannah's cheek as she stumbled backward, only his grip on her arm keeping her upright. "Let her go, Blackburn." Thomas's voice cut through the air like a blade. He stood at the entrance to the alley, his stance wide, hands clenched at his sides. Blackburn sneered. "Your cowboy protector again. This is between me and her. She's cost me everything with her meddling." "You cost yourself everything when you decided to steal," Thomas replied evenly, taking a step forward. Now let her go, or this gets worse for you, much worse." For a moment, Blackburn's grip tightened further, making Hannah wince. Then, with a shove that sent her sprawling against the wall, he released her and reached into his coat, pulling out a short whip. "You broke my good whip last time," Blackburn said, unfurling it with a flick of his wrist. "Had to get a new one, been waiting for a chance to use it." Thomas didn't flinch. "You really want to do this? Here, now?" "Oh, I do." Blackburn raised the whip. "Been thinking about it for 2 weeks." The whip cracked forward, but Thomas was ready. He sidestepped the lash, lunging forward to grab Blackburn's wrist before he could strike again. With a sharp twist, he forced the older man to drop the whip, then shoved him hard against the opposite wall. "I'm not going to fight you, Blackburn," Thomas said, his voice low and controlled despite the fury evident in his eyes. "But I will stop you from hurting Hannah or anyone else in this town." Blackburn struggled against Thomas's hold. "You have no right." "This is between me and what's going on here." Sheriff Taylor's authoritative voice interrupted as he appeared at the mouth of the alley, hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Behind him stood Mr. Richardson and several townspeople drawn by the commotion. Thomas released Blackburn but remained between him and Hannah. Mr. Blackburn was expressing his dissatisfaction with Miss Foster's accounting skills, he said dryly. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene: the whip on the ground, Hannah's renewed injury, Blackburn's disheveled appearance. "Is that so? Looks more like assault to me." "He attacked me," Hannah confirmed, touching her throbbing cheek gingerly. Richardson stepped forward. "Sheriff, I was just coming to speak with you about Mr. Blackburn. We've discovered evidence of embezzlement from the bank, nearly $500 taken from customers' accounts over the past 6 months. Blackburn's face drained of color. "That's a lie." "I was authorized to make those withdrawals. For legitimate bank business, perhaps," Richardson countered, "not to line your own pockets." Sheriff Taylor's expression hardened. "Mr. Blackburn, I think you'd better come with me. We have quite a bit to discuss." As the sheriff led a protesting Blackburn away, Thomas turned to Hannah, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" "I will be," she assured him, though her voice trembled slightly. "It seems I have a talent for angering that man." "You have a talent for honesty," Thomas corrected gently, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face, careful to avoid her injury. "And that's nothing to apologize for." Richardson approached them, his expression grave. "Miss Foster, I cannot apologize enough. I never imagined Blackburn would react so violently." "It's not your fault, Mr. Richardson," Hannah said. "He made his own choices. Nevertheless, I feel responsible." The banker glanced at Thomas with newfound respect. "Thank you for intervening, Mr. Vallance. It seems Miss Foster is fortunate to have you looking out for her." Thomas shook his head. "Hannah can look out for herself just fine. I just happened to be passing by at the right moment. Either way, you have my gratitude." Richardson turned back to Hannah. "Take tomorrow off, Miss Foster." "With pay, of course. You've certainly earned it after this ordeal." As Richardson departed, Thomas gently placed his arm around Hannah's shoulders. "Let's get you back to Mrs. Williams. She'll have something for that cheek." Hannah leaned into his strength, suddenly exhausted. "Thank you for being there, again." "I'm beginning to think it's my calling," Thomas replied with a small smile, "rescuing beautiful women from angry mercantile owners." Despite her pain, Hannah laughed. "If that's your calling, I hope business is usually slow." "The slowest," he agreed, his arm tightening protectively around her as they made their way back to the boarding house. News of Blackburn's arrest spread quickly through Willow Creek. By dinner time, everyone at Mrs. Williams's table had heard some version of the events, though the details varied wildly depending on who was telling the tale. "I heard he pulled a gun on Miss Foster," Sarah Miller, the schoolteacher, said with wide eyes. "Nonsense," Judge Harmon retorted. "It was a knife." "My friend at the barber shop saw the whole thing," Mrs. Williams sniffed disapprovingly. "It was a whip, which is bad enough. The man has always had a violent streak." She placed a gentle hand on Hannah's shoulder as she served the stew. "How's the cheek, dear?" "Tender, but the compress helped," Hannah replied, touched by the older woman's concern. Thomas, seated beside Hannah, had remained mostly silent throughout dinner, though his presence felt like a shield against the curious glances and well-meaning inquiries from the other boarders. When the meal concluded, he quietly asked if she would join him on the porch again, away from the chatter inside. The evening was mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine from the distant hills. They sat side by side on the porch swing, gently rocking as twilight deepened around them. "Richardson says the bank examiner arrived this afternoon," Hannah said after a comfortable silence. "He seems confident that we've uncovered all of Blackburn's manipulations." Thomas nodded. "That's good. What will happen to Blackburn now?" "Sheriff Taylor is holding him until the circuit judge arrives next week. Mr. Richardson says that with the evidence so clear, he'll likely face several years in territorial prison." Hannah sighed. "I still can't believe he risked everything for a few $100s. "Greed makes people do foolish things," Thomas observed, "though I suspect it was more than money driving him." "What do you mean?" Thomas turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "Men like Blackburn value power and control more than wealth." The money was just a means to feel important, to have something over others. Hannah considered this. That would explain why he was always so quick to accuse others of dishonesty. Perhaps he was trying to distract from his own. Possibly. Thomas reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "I'm just glad you're safe now." Hannah looked down at their joined hands, then back up to meet his gaze. "Because of you, again?" "No," Thomas shook his head, his voice soft but firm. "You saved yourself, Hannah. You uncovered his scheme, you stood your ground. I just happened to be there for the physical part. Still, I'm grateful you were." Thomas's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, sending unexpected shivers up her arm. "I've been thinking," he said carefully. "Sullivan mentioned that the livery delivers supplies to outlying farms and ranches every couple of weeks. The next run is this Saturday to the Thompson place about 10 miles north of town. It's supposed to be quite pretty out that way, with the creek widening into a small lake." He paused, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "I thought you might like to come along. We could bring a picnic lunch." Hannah felt warmth spread through her chest at the invitation. "I'd like that very much." "Good." The relief in his smile was endearing. "It's a day trip. We'd be back by evening." "I'll ask Mrs. Williams to help me pack a proper lunch," Hannah promised. "Though I should warn you, my cooking skills are rather basic." Thomas laughed. "After 3 months of trail food, I promise you couldn't disappoint me if you tried." As darkness settled around them, they continued talking about their pasts, their hopes, the simple pleasures of a life that suddenly seemed full of possibility. When they finally said goodnight, Thomas held her hand a moment longer than necessary, his eyes conveying emotions he wasn't yet ready to voice. Hannah fell asleep that night with a smile on her lips, despite her aching cheek, looking forward to Saturday with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the scenery and everything to do with the man who would be sharing it with her. Saturday dawned clear and bright, with just enough clouds to temper the summer heat. Hannah had spent the previous evening preparing for the outing with Mrs. Williams's enthusiastic assistance. The older woman had helped her pack a basket with fried chicken, biscuits, apple tarts, and a jar of lemonade, all the while offering thinly veiled comments about what a fine figure of a man Thomas was, and how some women would be lucky to catch the eye of such a steady fellow. Hannah had pretended not to understand the implications, though her blush had betrayed her. Thomas arrived at the boarding house promptly at 8, driving Sullivan's wagon, a sturdy vehicle loaded with supplies for the Thompson ranch. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His clothes were freshly laundered, his dark hair neatly combed, and he'd even added a clean bandana tied at his throat. "You look lovely," he said as Hannah emerged with the picnic basket, his admiring gaze taking in her simple blue dress and the ribbon she'd woven through her honey-brown hair. "Thank you," she replied, pleased that the bruising on her cheek had faded enough that a light dusting of powder mostly concealed it. "Is this suitable for a wagon ride?" "Perfect." Thomas took the basket and helped her up onto the seat, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. It's about 2 hours to the Thompson place. The road's decent, though a bit bumpy in places. As they set off, the morning bustle of Willow Creek gave way to the open country beyond rolling hills covered in summer grass, stands of pine and aspen shimmering in the breeze, the occasional farmhouse or distant herd of cattle dotting the landscape. Hannah found herself relaxing as they traveled, the tension of the past weeks melting away with each mile. Thomas proved to be an engaging travel companion, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his travels across the Western Territories. He had a quiet humor that Hannah increasingly appreciated and a way of listening that made her feel truly heard. "Have you ever thought of going back to Texas?" she asked as they followed the creek north, its winding path marked by a ribbon of cottonwoods and willows. Thomas considered the question. "Sometimes I have friends there, people who were good to me when I first started out, but there's nothing really calling me back." He glanced at her. "What about you? Do you miss Denver?" Hannah shook her head. "Not really. After my parents died, it never felt like home again. My aunt tried, but..." She trailed off, then smiled. "Actually, Willow Creek is beginning to feel more like home than anywhere has in a long time." "I know what you mean," Thomas said softly. They delivered the supplies to the Thompson Ranch just before noon, a prosperous cattle operation run by a boisterous man with a ready laugh and his equally welcoming wife. The Thompsons insisted they stay for coffee before heading back, eager for news from town. "Heard about Blackburn," Mr. Thompson said, shaking his head. "Can't say I'm surprised. Man always struck me as a bit too slick." "It's a terrible business," Mrs. Thompson added, passing Hannah a second cup of coffee. "But at least he's been caught before he could do more harm." "And I hear you had a hand in that, Miss Foster," Hannah demurred modestly. "I just noticed some discrepancies in the accounts." "Well, Richardson's lucky to have you," Mr. Thompson declared. "Bank's never been so well run from what I hear." After saying their goodbyes, Thomas drove the now empty wagon to the spot he had mentioned, a widening of the creek into a small, clear lake bordered by cottonwoods that provided welcome shade from the midday sun. He spread a blanket beneath the largest tree and helped Hannah unpack the picnic basket. "Mrs. Williams outdid herself," Thomas commented as Hannah arranged the food. "This is a feast." "She was quite invested in our outing," Hannah admitted with a small laugh. "I think she considers herself something of a matchmaker." Thomas raised an eyebrow, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Is that so? And how do you feel about that?" Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks but met his gaze steadily. "I think Mrs. Williams is a very perceptive woman." Something warmed in Thomas's eyes. "I've always thought so." They ate leisurely, talking and laughing as the afternoon stretched on. After the meal, they walked along the shore of the small lake, skipping stones across its surface and watching a family of ducks paddle among the reeds. "I never thanked you properly," Hannah said suddenly, stopping to face Thomas. "Not just for helping with Blackburn, but for believing in me from the start. You didn't know me at all, yet you took my side without hesitation." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Some things you don't need to think about, they're just right." He reached out tentatively, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "From the moment I saw you, something told me you were someone worth knowing, worth protecting if you needed it." Hannah's heart quickened at his touch. "And now that you know me, now I know I was right." His hand moved to cup her cheek gently. "You're the strongest, most honest person I've ever met, Hannah, and the most beautiful inside and out." "Thomas," she whispered, unable to find more words as he leaned closer. His kiss was gentle, almost reverent, a question as much as an answer. Hannah responded with all the emotion that had been building since that first day, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I didn't plan that," he admitted with a soft laugh. "I'm glad you didn't wait for a plan," Hannah replied, smiling up at him. They returned to the blanket beneath the cottonwood, sitting closer now, fingers intertwined as they watched the sunlight play across the water. Thomas spoke of his dreams for the future, saving enough to buy a small parcel of land near town, perhaps raising horses instead of cattle. "And you?" he asked. "What do you want for your future?" Hannah considered. I enjoy working at the bank, but someday I'd like to have a little shop of my own. Nothing grand, just a place selling practical things people need with fair prices and honest dealings." "You'd be good at that," Thomas said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "You have a way of making people trust you." "Most people," Hannah amended, thinking of Blackburn, people worth trusting, Thomas corrected. As the afternoon waned, they reluctantly packed up their picnic and loaded the wagon for the return journey. The ride back to town was quieter, filled with comfortable silences and occasional shared glances that spoke more than words could convey. The sun was setting as they reached the outskirts of Willow Creek, painting the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Thomas slowed the wagon to prolong these final moments alone together. "Thank you for today," Hannah said. "It was perfect." "It was," Thomas agreed. He hesitated, then added, "I'd like to call on you properly, Hannah, with Mrs. Williams's approval, of course." Hannah's heart swelled. "I'd like that very much." When they reached the boarding house, Thomas helped her down from the wagon, holding her hands in his a moment longer than necessary. "Tomorrow's Sunday," he said. "Would you allow me to escort you to church and perhaps for a walk afterward?" "I would be delighted," Hannah replied, unable to keep the happiness from her voice. Mrs. Williams was waiting in the parlor when Hannah entered, pretending to be absorbed in her knitting, though her eager expression betrayed her curiosity. "Have a nice day, dear?" she asked, failing utterly at nonchalance. "Wonderful," Hannah replied, unable to suppress her smile. "Thomas has asked to call on me formally. I hope that meets with your approval," the older woman beamed. "As if you needed to ask. I've been hoping he would speak up ever since he broke that whip of Blackburn's. A man who stands up for what's right is worth 10 of any other kind." Hannah couldn't disagree. The weeks that followed settled into a pleasant rhythm. Hannah continued to excel at the bank, where Mr. Richardson increasingly relied on her organizational skills and attention to detail. Thomas proved equally valuable at the livery, where his knowledge of horses and steady work ethic earned him Sullivan's complete trust and a second raise by the end of summer. Their courtship progressed with the measured pace of two people who understood the value of building something lasting. Sundays were spent at church and on long walks. Weekday evenings often found them on Mrs. Williams's porch, talking late into the night. Thomas taught Hannah to ride, borrowing gentle mares from the livery for afternoon excursions into the surrounding countryside. Hannah introduced Thomas to her favorite books, reading aloud to him on rainy evenings when outdoor activities were impossible. By autumn, their feelings for each other were obvious to everyone in town. Mrs. Williams had taken to referring to Thomas as "our young man" and had stopped seeking other boarders for the room he now permanently occupied, though he still maintained the pretense of living at the livery to preserve propriety. It was on a crisp October evening, with the cottonwoods along the creek turned golden in the fading light, that Thomas finally spoke of marriage. They had walked to their favorite spot by the water after Sunday dinner, where the first hints of frost clung to the shadows despite the afternoon sunshine. "I've been saving," Thomas said as they sat on a fallen log, watching the creek flow past. "Almost enough now for a down payment on that parcel of land I told you about, the one just north of town with the small cabin and good grazing." Hannah squeezed his hand encouragingly. "Mr. Sullivan mentioned you were close to your goal. He's been generous with the wages," Thomas acknowledged. "And Richardson put in a good word with the bank about a small loan for the remainder." He turned to face her fully, his expression suddenly serious. "Hannah, I didn't come to Willow Creek looking for anything more than work and a fresh start. I certainly never expected to find someone who would change everything about what I want for my future." Hannah's heart quickened. "What do you want for your future now?" "You," Thomas said simply. "A life with you if you'll have me." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a modest silver band with a single pearl set in its center. "I know it's not fancy, it's beautiful," Hannah interrupted, her eyes filling with tears. "I love you, Hannah Foster." Thomas took her hand, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "Will you marry me?" Yes, Hannah said without hesitation, her voice breaking on the word. Yes, Thomas, I will. He slid the ring onto her finger where it fit perfectly, then pulled her into an embrace that held all the promise of their future together. When their lips met, it was a seal on the vow they had just exchanged, a commitment born of mutual respect, shared values, and a love that had grown stronger with each passing day. Mrs. Williams cried openly when they returned to the boarding house and shared their news, declaring that she'd known from the first day that they were meant for each other. Judge Harmon, back in town for business, offered to perform the ceremony himself. Sarah Miller immediately volunteered to help with wedding preparations. Even Sullivan, gruff as ever, offered Thomas the day off when the time came, along with the loan of his best buggy for the occasion. They set the date for the first Saturday in November, agreeing that a small, simple ceremony would suit them best. Hannah wrote to her aunt in Denver with the news, receiving a warm reply and a promise to attend if her husband's health permitted the journey. Thomas had no family to invite, but the friends he had made in Willow Creek had become family enough. The weeks before the wedding passed in a flurry of activity. Thomas completed the purchase of the land and began making improvements to the small cabin, determined that it would be a proper home for his bride. Hannah continued her work at the bank while spending evenings sewing her wedding dress with Mrs. Williams's help, a simple but elegant creation of cream-colored cotton with lace trim salvaged from her mother's wedding gown, which her aunt had sent along with her letter. 2 days before the wedding, an unexpected visitor arrived in Willow Creek, Edwin Blackburn's son, Albert, a solemn young man in his 20s who had been living in Denver. He came to the bank specifically to speak with Hannah. "Miss Foster," he said after introducing himself, his manner formal but not unfriendly, "I've come to apologize for my father's actions and to make what restitution I can." Hannah, startled by his appearance, invited him into Mr. Richardson's office for privacy. "That's very kind, Mr. Blackburn, but no apology is necessary from you. You weren't responsible for your father's choices." "Perhaps not directly," Albert conceded, "but I feel a duty to address the harm he caused." He placed a bank draft on the desk between them. "This covers the full amount my father embezzled plus interest. I've already spoken with Mr. Richardson about it." "That's very honorable of you," Hannah said, genuinely impressed by the young man's integrity. Albert's expression softened slightly. "My father wasn't always the man you knew, Miss Foster. There was a time when he was honest and hardworking. After my mother died, something changed in him." He sighed. "I don't say that to excuse what he did, only to explain it somewhat." "I understand," Hannah said gently. "Loss affects us all differently." "Yes, well," Albert cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional direction of the conversation. "I've also come to settle my father's affairs here. The mercantile will be sold. I have a buyer from Cheyenne interested already." "I thought you should know. Thank you for telling me." As Albert rose to leave, he hesitated. "One more thing, Miss Foster. I heard in town that you're to be married this weekend. Please accept my best wishes for your happiness." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Blackburn." After he departed, Hannah sat for a moment, reflecting on the unexpected encounter. There was something fitting about this final resolution coming just before her wedding, a closing of one chapter before beginning the next. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, with a fresh dusting of snow covering the ground just enough to make everything glisten in the early light without impeding travel. Hannah woke early, too excited to sleep, and spent the quiet hours before sunrise writing in her journal, recording her thoughts on this most momentous of days. Mrs. Williams bustled about, preparing a special breakfast and fussing over every detail of Hannah's appearance. Sarah Miller arrived mid-morning with wildflowers she had somehow managed to find despite the season, arranging them into a small bouquet tied with blue ribbon. "Something borrowed," Sarah declared, producing a delicate lace handkerchief. "It was my grandmother's. And something blue, Mrs. Williams added, fastening a small sapphire brooch to Hannah's dress. "My husband gave me this on our 10th anniversary. I've always thought it would look lovely on you." By noon, Hannah was dressed and ready, her hair arranged in soft curls beneath a simple veil. The ceremony would take place at the small church at 1 o'clock, followed by a reception at the hotel, where Mr. Simmons, now much more respectful of Hannah since her rise in standing at the bank, had offered the use of the dining room at a reduced rate. Thomas, by tradition, would not see her until the ceremony. He had spent the night at the livery, where Sullivan and several other men from town had kept him company with stories and advice that had apparently continued well into the early hours, judging by the occasional burst of laughter Hannah had heard from her window. A light knock at her door announced the arrival of Mr. Richardson, who had offered to escort her to the church in his carriage. "Miss Foster," he said when she opened the door, his eyes widening in appreciation, "you look absolutely radiant." "Thank you, Mr. Richardson." Hannah smiled, touched by his kindness. Over the past months, the banker had become something of a father figure to her, his respect for her abilities professionally matched by his concern for her well-being personally. "It's an honor to stand in for your father today," Richardson continued, offering his arm. "Though I'm sure he would have been immensely proud to see the woman you've become." Hannah blinked back tears. "That means a great deal to me." The small church was filled to capacity when they arrived, with what seemed like half the town in attendance. Hannah paused in the vestibule, taking a deep breath to calm her racing heart. Then, with Richardson at her side, she began the walk down the aisle toward her future. Thomas stood at the altar, tall and handsome in his new suit, his eyes never leaving hers as she approached. The love in his gaze was so palpable it seemed to fill the entire church, wrapping around her like a physical embrace. Judge Harmon performed the ceremony with dignified simplicity, his deep voice carrying clearly through the hushed building as Thomas and Hannah exchanged their vows. When Thomas placed a second ring, a simple gold band, on Hannah's finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady, his voice clear and certain as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her all the days of their lives. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Harmon declared, beaming at them both. "Mr. Vallance, you may kiss your bride." Thomas cupped Hannah's face gently between his hands, as if she were the most precious thing in the world, and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes and applause from their assembled friends. The celebration afterward was joyous and lively, with music provided by local musicians and enough food to feed twice the number of guests, thanks to the combined efforts of Mrs. Williams and several other women from town. Dancing continued well into the evening, with Thomas proving surprisingly adept at the waltz despite his protestations of inexperience. As the festivities wound down, the newlyweds slipped away to begin their new life together in the cabin Thomas had prepared with such care, a small but comfortable home that already contained touches of them both. Books Hannah had collected, tools Thomas treasured, a quilt Mrs. Williams had given them as a wedding gift. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vallance," Thomas said softly as he carried her across the threshold in the traditional manner. "Home," Hannah repeated, the word resonating with all the meaning they had built into it together. "It sounds perfect." Winter passed in a haze of newfound marital bliss as Thomas and Hannah settled into life together. The cabin, while small, proved cozy and comfortable, especially once Thomas added a lean-to kitchen and expanded the main room to accommodate the furniture Hannah had begun acquiring through careful saving and strategic bartering with traveling merchants. Thomas continued working at the livery while developing his own small horse breeding operation, starting with 2 quality mares purchased from a rancher outside of Laramie. Hannah maintained her position at the bank, though she and Thomas had agreed that when children came along, she would likely reduce her hours or work from home. Spring brought renewed energy and expansion. Thomas built a proper stable for his growing collection of horses, which now included a promising stallion on loan from Sullivan as part of a breeding arrangement. Hannah planted a vegetable garden and a small orchard of apple trees, determined to make their property as self-sufficient as possible. By summer, their hard work was showing tangible results. The first foal born on their property, a spirited colt with a white blaze, was pronounced exceptional by Sullivan and already promised to a buyer in Cheyenne once it was properly trained. Hannah's garden yielded enough produce to sell the excess in town, providing a small but steady additional income. It was on a warm evening in late August, just over 9 months after their wedding, that Hannah shared the news she had suspected for several weeks. "Thomas," she said as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the distant hills in gold and crimson, "I visited Dr. Pearson today." Thomas turned to her, concern immediately crossing his face. "Are you unwell?" "Quite the opposite." Hannah took his hand, placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." The joy that transformed Thomas's expression was something Hannah knew she would remember for the rest of her life, pure, unrestrained happiness that lit his eyes and curved his mouth into a smile unlike any she had seen before. "A baby," he repeated in wonder, his voice thick with emotion. "When?" "February, Dr. Pearson thinks." Hannah laughed as Thomas pulled her into a careful embrace as if she had suddenly become fragile. "I'm not made of glass, you know." "I know," he murmured against her hair, "but you're carrying something precious now." Their child, a son they named James Thomas Vallance, was born on a cold but clear February morning in 1878, with Mrs. Williams in attendance as midwife and Thomas pacing anxiously outside until the first lusty cries announced his son's arrival. When Thomas was finally allowed into the room, the sight of Hannah cradling their newborn son broke something open inside him, releasing tears he hadn't known were waiting. "He's perfect," Thomas whispered, gently touching the downy head. "And you're amazing." Hannah smiled tiredly up at him. "We did this together." "No," Thomas disagreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You did the hard part. I just stood around looking worried." Mrs. Williams snorted from where she was cleaning up. "And wearing a path in my carpet with your pacing. Never seen a man so nervous in all my days." The years that followed brought more blessings and occasional challenges. A second child, a daughter named Elizabeth Rose, joined their family in 1880, completing their happiness. Thomas's horse breeding business flourished, eventually allowing him to leave the livery and focus solely on his own enterprise. Hannah continued working part-time at the bank, bringing the children with her when necessary, as Mr. Richardson had become quite attached to his honorary grandchildren. Willow Creek itself grew and prospered. The railroad finally came through in 1883, bringing increased commerce and population. Albert Blackburn's buyer had transformed the mercantile into a thriving general store with fair prices and honest dealings, everything Hannah had once dreamed of creating herself, though she found her divided career between banking and motherhood more than satisfying. Edwin Blackburn, they heard, had served 3 years in territorial prison before being released and moving to California, where he had family. He never returned to Willow Creek, and over time his name faded from local conversation, remembered only as a cautionary tale about the consequences of dishonesty. On a warm summer evening in 1886, 10 years after they first met, Thomas and Hannah sat on the porch of their now expanded home, watching their children play in the yard with the newest addition to their family, a gentle collie puppy that Thomas had brought home as a surprise the previous week. "Do you ever think about that day?" Hannah asked, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder. "The day we met, often," Thomas admitted, his arm tightening around her. "Though I prefer to think about everything that came after," Hannah smiled. "So do I." She looked out at their thriving farm, the stable now housing a dozen fine horses, the expanded garden, the small orchard beginning to bear fruit. "We've built a good life, haven't we?" "The best," Thomas agreed, turning to kiss her softly. "And it all started because Blackburn was fool enough to raise his whip a second time." "No," Hannah corrected gently. "It started because you were brave enough to catch it." Thomas laughed. "Maybe we're both right." His expression grew more serious. "I thank God every day that I rode into Willow Creek when I did. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me, Hannah. And you were the answer to a prayer I didn't even know I was making." she replied, resting her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. My cowboy hero. Hardly a hero, Thomas demurred, just a man who knew a good thing when he saw it. As the sun set on another day of their shared life, Hannah reflected on the journey that had brought them here from a moment of violence interrupted to a decade of love built day by day through hard work, mutual respect, and unwavering commitment. The scars of the past had faded, replaced by the joy of the present and the promise of the future they continued to build together. In the distance, their children laughed, the sound carried on the evening breeze like music. Thomas's arm was warm and secure around her shoulders. Their home stood solid behind them, a testament to dreams made real through perseverance and partnership. This, Hannah thought, was what happily ever after truly meant not an ending, but a continuing story written together, page by page, year by year, with love as its guiding principle and shared purpose as its strength. Thomas seemed to read her thoughts, as he so often did. I love you, Hannah Vallance, he said softly. More today than yesterday, and not as much as I will tomorrow. And I love you, she replied, the words as true and certain as they had been on their wedding day. Always. As twilight deepened into night, they remained together on the porch, content in the knowledge that the life they had built from that first dramatic meeting had become everything they had hoped for and more, a love story written not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments of understanding, the shared burdens of hardship, and the simple joy of building a future, hand in hand, day by day, together.